Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming and giving up your evening to listen to me speak about the Hill Farm works at Sharnbrook. My name is Carol Simmonds. I'm a project officer in the Northampton office of MOLA, and in 2023, I was part of a team who undertook archaeological work on the east side of Sharnbrook. So when I was preparing for this talk, mindful that the results are still coming in, we still are awaiting a lot of the specialist reports that will help refine dating and have some more interesting stories to say. I wanted to focus more on how the project came about, where we are with it, and also to thank and to pay tribute to the fantastic team of people who I worked with on the project and those who are being involved at the moment. Archaeology is by its very nature a collaborative thing. It is very much a people thing. It's about past people and it's done by current people for future people. So I think it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge their work. And I do know that some of them are attending this evening. Nice to see you all. And hopefully I don't disappoint. As a project officer, my role is to lead larger scale teams, larger scale projects, more complex archaeological sites, and not just the archaeology, it's everything that goes with it. So it's the health and safety, the team management, it's managing expectations and risk for the client. We are there to provide a service as part of a planning process. So that's going to form part of my talk. If next slide, please, Kat. Thank you. This presentation does have images of skeletal human remains. It is considered to be good manners and good ethics to display some form of caveat before as part of the talk. So you will see a similar slide to this just before the images are shown. And it's about halfway through. If you feel uncomfortable about viewing the skeletal remains, please feel free to kind of walk away from the computer for a little bit, kind of minimize your screen. But I just wanted to make sure that you were all warned. Next slide, please, Kat. Okay, so today's talk, part one is a project. So that's the genesis of the project, effectively the journey of where we got to where we are now. Part two is the archaeology. That's the bit that some of you are probably more interested in. And that's the bit where the images of human remains are shown. Part three is bookending it. It's basically a what's next. It's where we are, what we're doing, and how we're going to do it. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. So this is the part of the journey of the project. Archaeology is, in this country, in the commercial sector, is tied to the planning process. When developers, such as our clients, Redrow and Bellway, wish to build, they are often assigned a condition as part of their planning permission to require them to undertake archaeological works. That condition is set by their local planning authority on advice from their archaeological advisors. They then, if that condition is accepted, then they are required to get an archaeological company, a commercial organisation such as MOLA, involved to undertake that work for them. And it's under the process of competitive tendering. As I said at the start, we are there to provide a service. So this shows that it's not just us, and it's much more of a complicated process than perhaps people might think. That process is there to help manage risk and to make sure everything is in the open and for fairness. So the planning reference number is at the top. If you wish to go and search, I think it's Bedford Borough. We have what we call an accession code, which is basically when all the work is completed, it will go to a local museum. I believe in this case it's the Higgins in Bedford. That is the code which the archive will be stored in the future. So For this project in 2020, London Archaeology, who have multiple offices across the UK, undertook a geophysical survey. Geophysical survey and what came afterwards, the first phase of trial trenching by Albion Archaeology, are what we call evaluation. They are there to indicate and characterise the potential for work. So for the geophysical survey, it confirmed the presence of what was already previously known from aerial crop mark data, that there were a number of enclosures and basically indications of previous activity on the site. The trenching confirmed that presence and perhaps suggested what the size of the features were, what the date of them were, and so on. This was followed and summarised by a desk-based assessment, which is basically looked at historic maps, the historic environment record, some of the documentary resources that are available. And that was undertaken by BSA Heritage. So by this stage, there are 3 stages of evaluation have been completed to inform the planning. Bedford Borough Council supply archaeology advice to the local authority planners. The planners supply the developers with a condition. The archaeologist for Bedford Borough then issues what we call a brief. The brief basically states the rationale for their decision making as to what is required. Basically, we dig where we are told to dig, and it's within the red line boundary of a site. We can't just go trying to answer questions elsewhere in a field just because we find it interesting. We are governed by various bits of administration. So in 2023, MOLA was commissioned after a tendering process by Bellway and Redrow to start the work. And the pre-site documentation I'm going to touch on very briefly in the next couple of slides. Our work included a few more trial trenches in an area that had not been trenched. And then we went into what we call archaeological mitigation. And that is open area excavation. It's larger areas to try and look at more of the sequence, to go from a keyhole surgery to basically an entire body, for example. We finished the work at the end of 2023, the field work, and we are currently in what we call the initial stage of reporting, called analysis stage. So all that is ongoing. Next slide, please, Kat. Okay, so this is where my desire for interactivity may go horrifically wrong. As part of the pre-site material, we have to basically undertake risk assessments and method statements. So the health and safety aspects. On a side of this nature, that's quite important because there's an awful lot going on. So in chat, just to see if this is all working well, could you please, if you are able, see if you can spot any potential hazards that might have impacted our work? I'll just give you a couple of minutes to see that, see if anybody wants to come on. Be brave. I am looking at the chat, so okay, thank you, Lloyd. Anybody else? Yep. Thank you, Joe, John, Sean, Gareth, and Jill. Yes, overhead wires. So essentially, that's the main hazard for this area. What I was trying to get across. Those power lines, I believe, are 33 kV volts. They are, so it is a substantial power line, and the one on the left of the frame, so the one that's nearest to you, that is actually kind of has a second one that's going off it. So essentially, where my colleague is standing, more or less underneath the power lines in the middle distance, thanks, Kat. We basically that's where the spoil heaps are going, just the other side of the power lines on the open grass. The excavation area is more or less behind me. That's where that spoil is going. So the machines, the dumper trucks, which are substantial in size, have to pass underneath that power lines. in order to manage that safely, so there are no issues and no accidents, we have to make sure that we have special crossing points. Other hazards that we came across, if next slide please, Kat, had to manage are, so the not just utilities, there was also a water main at the southern end of the site, which meant that we reduced significantly the area that we could go at. We also had to deal with hedgerows, and there's various ecological aspects, so such as bats in the farm buildings. No newts, fortunately, but obviously it was in full summer and autumn, so you have to be very careful of anything else that might pop up in wild animals and things like that. As I've said, spoil heaps is that we had a very specific areas of where we had to put the spoil generated from our excavations. You'll see on some of the photos following that the mounds were substantial. So basically it's safe routes through. Preservation areas, so essentially areas that we weren't going to be touching. Asbestos in the farm buildings and no-go areas, such as the degraded buildings and also private properties, and also public access. There were public rights of way going across the site. Bellway and Redrow had obtained notices to kind of temporarily close those pathways off before we started the work, which was good, but we had to make sure the site was secure. So therefore, it's reducing the risk. So part of my job, as I said at the beginning, is to make sure that work is done safely. There is a lot more to it than the archaeology, and in most cases, the archaeology is the easy bit. Next slide, please, Kat. So this is a rather lovely overhead view of the site during machine excavation. This is area 1 at the northern end, so we have 3 to 4 areas of excavation. Sharnbrook is right up at the top right. Templars Way, which is basically forms the northern boundary and western boundary of the site, is also down on the right. You've got the main railway line passing across, and Hill Farm, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, is down at the top left. This is looking across the Great Ouse Valley. We have our own dedicated small unmanned aircraft pilots in the company, not just to get wonderful views like this, but also to fly and capture the images that we have as auto mosaics. So therefore, they are the overhead views of the site that can be therefore inserted into mapping. So therefore, it can be seen relative to ordnance data, survey data. The spoil heap is very visible. This was partway through the strip, so you should be able to get an idea of the scale of the project from this. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of more technical data now. That's the size of the machine we were using. That is a 35-ton mechanical excavator driven by a very good driver called Steve. That is a 360 wheel, so that arm is also extreme, has a very long reach, and that is a 2 metre wide, or 3 metre wide actually, ditching bucket on the thing. So 3 metres is a substantial bit of is a substantial bucket. So the bucket is currently putting the soil in the dumper truck. We've basically on this shot have taken off the topsoil, so that's your modern plough soils, material that's accumulated in the last couple of 100 years. Below that is a subsoil. The subsoil is basically a deposit below the topsoil that is made by man agency of man, or people, sorry, and it's, in this case, it's probably post-Roman. That's largely because the Roman and other material basically is sealed by the subsoil, so it has to be after the Roman period. That strip surface is the level we're going to. In this case, it's about 40 centimetres or so, 40 to 50 centimetres. Next slide, please. The interesting bit, thank you. So, site timeline. We thought it would be interesting and to try and show you just how long this site had activity on it for. So we do have some basically Bronze Age pottery, which is an earliest thing from a pit. You may have seen pictures in the press about that. So there'll be another photograph to show you. At the same time that pottery was being deposited in the pit, there were across the valley barrow cemeteries. A barrow, for those who aren't aware, is basically a burial mound. The dates at the top, we have CE for Common Era. That's basically a secularized version of AD and BC. Number of years before the present. Again, just to kind of show you the times in the amount of years involved. In the Iron Age and Roman period, we have what appears to be at the moment a settlement and farmstead. So basically, a small group of people living and working the fields around it. Probably livestock and mixture of livestock and agriculture, although the finds and environmental samples will confirm that. And we have a couple of burials. Around the time, I was told yesterday afternoon by a member of the Sharnbrook local history group that there hasn't been that much found of that by way of Iron Age in around Sharnbrook itself. So although there are slightly further afield, there are known pit alignments and ditches and enclosures. There is a temple, site of a temple nearby, as is a villa and other settlement activity. There is the Via Tourist Society identified a possible Roman road nearby also. Moving into the medieval period, you'll note from the dates that we basically anything that is after the Roman period we're calling medieval at the moment. We do have some settlement activity, which was a bit of a surprise to me when I found out about it. I wasn't expecting the medieval so much, and it was quite nice to have. We also have the remnants of the medieval open field system. So there's a little bit of activity, and then there's a lot of ploughing going on. Around there, you have cemeteries. Around Sharnbrook, you have a cemetery, watermill, and the castle. And then after that, it seems to go back to farmland and pasture. I'm going to be mainly focusing, apart from a little bit of slide about the pottery, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the Iron Age. The Roman, from what I can see at the moment, until we get the reports through, is kind of there in the background. The Iron Age seems to dominate the site. Okay, next slide, please, Kat. So this is the full area that we found. The red lines are the excavation areas. The blue is the archaeology that was found. Our 3 planned areas ended up being 4 in several parts because of the constraints given by overheads and by the hedgerows. What we ended up excavating was about 10 hectares. The development area as a whole was, I believe, about 30 to 35 hectares. So we investigated about a third. That's about 24.7 acres in Imperial. I'm mainly going to be looking at features in Area 1 and in Area 3, partly because partway through the project, MOLA very kindly allowed me a sabbatical to go off and study. So I left the project in the very capable hands of my colleagues Rob Simister-Falvey, who's been very kindly talking to school children, and various other people, including Katie Davis and various others as well. So I only really saw Area 3 and Area 1 being done. At the moment, until the specialist material come through, I can't say much about Area 2 or Area 4. Next slide, please, Gab. Okay, second challenge. Let's see if this works again. In chat, it'll go from basically if we divide this area into thirds, so we've got the top third at the northern end, so the top is at north is at top, sorry. So we have that northern third. We have the nice big green swathe where we had to basically leave between the overheads, which going across the area. This kind of more or less across there. Thank you, Kat. We have the middle third and the bottom third. In this area, there are those features: ditches, post holes, pits, ring ditches, watering hole, medieval open field cultivation, and modern land drains. If you could put, say, top third, middle third, or bottom third, and then where you think the features are, let's see if this works. See how good your eyes are. Don't be shy. I shall take the opportunity to have some water. Okay, thanks, Lloyd and Nick. Anybody else? Lloyd, Lloyd and Nick, you are both correct. Thank you, Rob. Okay. Yep. What about the bottom third? You've all done pretty well with the top and middle. Can you see anything in the bottom third? And the bottom part of the site did cause us some issues as well in the field. So post holes, okay. Land drains. Cat, behave. I see you. Cat's just giving you all a nice big clue if you were paying attention to her cursor. Okay, shall I put you all out of your misery? Okay, yeah, thanks, Joe. Yep, Lloyd and Joe, you're absolutely bang on the money there. Okay, thank you all. Kat, please, let's put them out of the misery, please. Right, so post holes and pits, a bit difficult to spot. I mean, there are some pits in the top third, next to the so essentially the blue lines, the teal lines, sorry, are ditches. Lloyd was absolutely spot on with the two ring ditches in the pink circle. Rob, thank you, Rob, for the watering hole in the small pink circle. The difference between a watering hole and a well is more structured. Watering hole, I think, often is seen as being used for a livestock mainly rather than for people. Medieval open field cultivation is the dark blue arrows, and then modern land drains are dark blue dash lines. The reason why I think some people perhaps struggled with the southern third is because that part of the site is on lower lying land. It's at the bottom of the hill. We had a really lovely limestone at the top, and then the lower third was covered in what we call hill wash or colluvium. And basically that is material that is washed down over time to basically and basically covers over everything else. In this instance, however, the archaeology cuts it, and I'll come on to why that's actually quite interesting in a bit. It actually makes a bit more sense from the air than it does on the ground. You'll see in a slide later on that we had real difficulty trying to identify that ditch. And then when we did identify the ditch and put what we call a slot through it, we found something a bit unexpected. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to focus on a little bit on the pit, which is a blue arrow, so pit 242. That is the pit with the Bronze Age pottery. The large enclosure ditch up at the top. Basically, I just want to will be making the point that the amount of effort that would have been taken to excavate the ditch in the first place for the settlement or the farmstead was substantial, and several of my colleagues expended a great amount of effort to dig it themselves. To try and find the store, identify the store, and get some dating from it. The enclosure ditch is Iron Age. Next slide, please. So this is the pottery that you've probably seen some pictures of. Too early to say at the moment, but the very, very initial view is that this is a kind of a deliberate deposit, partly because the pottery is in quite good condition, and also at least two of the sherds fit together. I can't tell you at this stage whether it's just one vessel or multiple. It's likely part of a beaker. It has been provisionally dated to the early Bronze Age, and at the bottom is a section drawing of the pit. I think it's Georgia who did this one. So basically, as part of it, part of the recording process, we draw effectively sections, the profiles across the features to provide the record. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is where I start acknowledging some of the work that was done. It's important, I think, to do that because all too often, I think the archaeologists often end up being anonymised and their work is not credited enough. So we're calling this a statement ditch simply because of the size of it. It's two different views of the same slot through it. So a slot is where we are sampling the ditch to work out what is going on. They're often called interventions as well. This ditch we knew would be substantial. When you've been doing the job a while, you can start to predict what might be large features and might take a little bit more time. That is why we went fairly wide. So it's about 2.5 meters wide, our slot. And we got the Peter and Stephen, who are shown in the bottom picture, to basically step it as they go, simply so they could get in and out safely. And then we put orange fencing around it. So the bottom picture has Stephen and Peter looking very pleased with themselves partway through the recording. That is a 1 meter scale in front of them, in front of their feet. That should give you an idea of the amount of material that they had to move. So it would have been a substantial effort to dig out of the bedrock in the Iron Age, and it's an even large effort in the present day. There is a statement ditch. The earth has to go somewhere. Whether it was a bank or somewhere that was spread elsewhere, can't tell you at this stage. We need to look more at the evidence that we have. But that would have taken a huge amount of time to dig. Next slide, please. Okay, so this next one, I would just want to kind of show you the issues we had with visibility. So the dark blue boxes are our slots and our interventions. This ditch is in the middle section. It's that one that is kind of almost like an L-shaped ditch, kind of curving around into the bottom. And it's basically, we had difficulty working out what was going on. So instead of putting just a couple of slots through, we put quite a few through just to kind of work out how many ditches we had, where they were going, and what the relationships were. Next slide, please. So this is basically from the pink arrow looking through. So I think that's Steve and Brody, I think, finishing off some excavation. We fence off the deeper features to try and as a visible marker, basically as a hazard warning, because we don't want any accidents to happen. The slot right that's in front of the frame with the scale, that was basically put there to work out what was going on. So there are, I think, 2 ditches in there. The darker one that's underneath the red part of the post. Can you move your cursor, please, to show people? There, yeah. I think that is the one that is cutting the lighter one that's on the right-hand side. So it's very, very subtle gradations of soil changes and colours, and that's also how we know where to dig to target features. We do the areas where we're told to dig, and then within those excavation areas, I know that we have to target certain features in a certain way. So that is the rationale. Next slide, please. Okay, this is your trigger warning. I have about 5 to 6 slides of human remains. If you want to minimize your screen, please do so. And I will verbally say when I have finished showing. Okay, next slide, please, Cap. Okay, so that overall image that we had towards the start of this section would have shown these things had you been able to zoom into a sufficient scale. They're both in the southern area on lower lying ground. The colluvium is there. The ditches cut the colluvium. And then we had a cremation in the teal box, which by this point we'd lifted. It was in a shallow pit. And then the burial, the inhumation, was in a pit that was cut into the infilled ditch. So the ditch had gone out of use before the burial had been placed, which raises a few interesting questions. Next slide, please, Cap. So, cremation first. This is Peter. Peter was very busy the first few months of the project. He got to do his first, I believe it was his first cremation. He might be able to tell me if he's in chat whether that's true or not. We found the cremation fairly early on. Before we lifted it, in fact, before we touched it properly, we basically had to kind of get a license to exhume human remains from the Ministry of Justice. Fortunately, at that stage, we were fairly quick with a turnaround, so we were able to start dealing with the cremation very promptly. We cannot start clearing human remains until we have that bit of paper with us. It's most important, and again, it's another bit of administration, but it shows that we are there to treat the human remains with respect that they deserve. Thank you, Peter. He's just put in chat, it's his first cremation. So the current view is that it's a late Iron Age. It is an urn, so it's a complete urn. The initial analysis is that it's likely a adult male, or an adult anyway. I'm not sure about biological sex yet. Basically what Peter is doing there, he's excavating around the charcoal material around it and putting it into sample buckets so it can be put through the sieves to work out whether there's any more burnt remains there or any other artifacts. Then basically we wrap the the urn up, and then what we call block lift it, and then the actual contents of the urn are excavated in the office by one of our fantastic team in the processing labs. That way, it is a controlled piece of work. It is a substantial piece of work to look at cremations and any form of human remains. The interesting thing is that there was some ferrous staining, which we thought at the time was initially thought to be iron nails, perhaps used in the construction of a funeral pyre. One of those objects now comes through as it's been X-rayed, and it could be something else. It's thought that it could be a brooch of some form because they've got the wires forming the coils forming for where the pin was. If so, that makes it really interesting, and it has great potential to tell us more about how people treated the dead in the late Iron Age, certainly locally. The funeral pyre aspect is also interesting because that suggests that perhaps that the funeral pyre was close by and then they were placed in the ground. Sometimes what you often find is that they are cremated elsewhere, and as some people might do is they may keep an urn of the ashes on the mantelpiece before they're buried. They are what they call curated. Next slide, please. So the skeleton. It's what we call a crouched inhumation. It's extremely tightly crouched. The initial analysis suggests it's an adult male. there's bone preservation. The skull, as you can see, is just slightly collapsed in on itself. That is a 50 centimetre scale. So that pit, I think, was about just under a metre long. Um, it's very tightly crouched, which our Chris, who's one of our osteologists, was thinking whether the body had been uh, put aside somewhere else, maybe buried somewhere else, and then later on lifted and put in the pit where it could be better manipulated. But then again, that is something for the osteologist to determine later. Next slide, please, Kat. Okay, so this is just to emphasise the issues the team had on site. Is you got on the right hand side of the frame, you've kind of got quite nice orange patches with grey patches, kind of thing. And that is the natural substrate with colluvium on top of it. On the left of the frame, it's a different story, and that dark ditch that was in the bottom third is kind of snaking away into the rear left of the frame. We basically put a slot here just to determine what was the relationship between the colluvial deposits and whether the ditches were actually there or not. So finding the skeleton was a little bit of a surprise. It wasn't something that we'd anticipated. Fortunately, as I said, we did have the burial license at the time, so we were able to proceed to expose the skeleton and deal with it accordingly. That is a 1 metre scale again on the ditch section. There are 3 ditches, I think, in that slot. The nice dark one that's then cut by that one. Yeah, was it 3 or 4? Something like that anyway. So there is a real sequence of features there, and the skeleton, given the fact it wasn't truncated by any of the ditches, must have been put in the latest of the sequence. Next slide, please. Okay, that's all the human remains dealt with. So if you wish to maximise your screen again, please do so. Going up to Area 1 now. This was at the northern end, so this was probably half a kilometre away from Area 3, if not slightly more. This is much more kind of livestock and domestic focused working areas rather than boundaries. And apart from the enclosure of the roundhouse, of course. Here we have a nice oval enclosure, which I will show you a picture of shortly and go through. We have in the middle, we have another enclosure with a south-facing entrance. We had in total 6 roundhouse ring ditches across the site. Roundhouses were generally in use from certainly the Neolithic in some form up until into the Roman period, so several thousand years, obviously not all at the same time, but they're generally defined by an eave strip gully, which tends to be what we end up finding, which encircles or surrounds the actual post-built structure. If you go to places such as Castell Henllys in southwest Wales and to Butser and various other locations, you can see reconstructions of these. They are quite, I think, works of genius in terms of how constructed. Very much a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The eave strip gully, basically the roof would go down to the ground as a cone, and then so essentially the gully is acting as a drain, draining the water away from the roof and away from the structure, base of the structure itself. We very rarely find the post holes associated with them. For post structure, on the other hand, they have a variety of possible uses. One is that they are granaries or hayricks. Sorry, they could be granaries. Another is that they could be hayricks. So essentially, they're storing. They are raised platforms on 4 posts. Sometimes you can get 6 posts, and they might have a shelter on top. They're basically there to stop the foodstuffs from rotting, to keep them safe from rodents and everything else like that. It's one of many ways in which people used to store food in the past. You also have storage pits as well. And elsewhere across this area, there are pits for that would have been used for waste and used for storage. Okay, next slide, please. Right, the oval-shaped enclosure. This is, I think, a very lovely photograph of the enclosure. The ditches that form it are much clearer than in Area 3, I think. It's 29 metres across. We are looking roughly northwest. It may have had an earthwork bank, but we may not be able to tell from the sections that we put through. We often can't. Variety of possible uses. It had multiple phases. So at the top, can you see that there's this that's kind of almost like an L-shaped ditch kind of coming down quite sharply, and then it kind of curves. It's kind of, I think it cuts the other one that's going underneath it that on a more of an angle. So there are at least two phases of activity at that point. It looks as though it's got two possible opposing entranceways. And if they're used for livestock management, basically being used as a corral or a counting area or basically a place to manage livestock. The artifact spot dates suggest the Iron Age. Next slide, please. Okay, so the medieval. I believe that medieval was found across areas 1 and 2. And a little bit in the small area 4. I just wanted to focus on the medieval remains in the southwestern end of area 1 because it's quite close to Templars Way, and therefore a bit closer to the actual core of the village. Post-Roman pottery, we had just over 1,000 sherds with a total weight of just over a kilo, which is a reasonable amount for a rural site. Early medieval date, mostly dating from 1000 to 1100. So that is what we call Saxo-Norman. So around the time of the conquest. After 1200, activity seems to drop off. There is a real lack of later medieval pottery. That's after 13th, 14th century. So that's quite interesting itself. When I was yesterday afternoon, when I was speaking to the local historical group, they informed me that at Castle Close, when they'd done some test holes and such, they were able to find hearths and other remains and a corn dry that had a 12th century date from them as well. So I think that the dating is quite serendipitous in a way. Next slide, please. Okay, so the final home straight, folks. What's next? The Archaeological Archive. So the archive will include maps, plans, photographs, site records and artefacts. And that is Joe there, who is surveying in the dark remnants of a ditch and the slot that we put through in the wet weather. So just as I show you that we do work in all weathers as well. Next slide, please. So we are currently this is basically a workflow just to show you where we are at the moment, where we are going. We're currently in assessment report stage. There are two main stages of reporting for a size and project of this magnitude. The first stage is the assessment report, also known as the updated project design and post-excavation assessment. Bit of a mouthful. This is basically reporting on we came, we saw, we found, this is what we're going to do with it. The analysis report segues on from that and is basically, this is what we think happened. It's there as a synthesis of the data. It's there to put it into its wider archaeological context. We are partway through stage 1. And then once those reports have been accepted by the planning archaeologist, they and the artifacts and the records will be submitted to the Higgins Museum as forming the archive. It's important to note that the reports will be made publicly available once approved. This is an important part of the planning process. It's also must be noted that when the archive is submitted and accepted, that concludes the archaeological planning process for the applicant. So the condition has been fulfilled. Next slide, please. Slightly soppy end note, but I think very important. I wasn't here for this one. I think I was in the middle of Birmingham at the time. So I just wanted to make sure that the team were thanked, and it isn't just the people in the photo there who were a small portion of the team that were on site. It's also those in the office, the specialists, the project management, the events team, and also the kind of other contractors as well. As I mentioned earlier on, the excavation, mechanical excavation was done by a group called West Home, and their drivers are fantastic. But I just want to conclude, next slide please, by saying thank you very much. And I'm done.